The bullet that killed Marshal Robert Irving's brother came through the window of a saloon in Lovelock, Nevada on a Tuesday afternoon in June of 1878, and everything Robert thought he knew about his future died with Samuel that same day. Robert had been standing at the bar, his hand wrapped around a whiskey glass he had not yet lifted to his lips, when the shot rang out. Samuel crumpled beside him, blood spreading across his vest before Robert could even process what had happened. The shooter was never found. The investigation went cold within a week. Robert resigned his position as deputy marshal the following month and took work as a ranch hand, unable to stomach the badge that reminded him of his failure to protect the only family he had left. That was 2 years ago. Now, at 28 years old, Robert worked cattle on the Henderson Ranch outside of Lovelock, keeping mostly to himself, speaking only when spoken to, and avoiding town except when absolutely necessary. He had grown hard in those 2 years, his face weathered beyond his years, his eyes carrying a weight that made most people look away. He was good with horses and better with cattle, and the Hendersons paid him fairly and did not ask questions about the past he clearly wanted to forget. It was a Thursday morning in late April of 1880 when Robert rode into town with a wagon to pick up supplies for the ranch. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of summer heat to come. He guided the horses down Main Street, past the general store and the post office, past the saloon where Samuel had died and which Robert still could not bring himself to enter. He was focused on his task, his mind already calculating the weight of the feed sacks he would need to load, when he heard it. Laughter. Pure and bright and full of genuine joy. Robert turned his head toward the sound and saw her for the first time. She was standing in the small yard beside the newly built schoolhouse, surrounded by at least a dozen children ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, and she was smiling as she watched 2 boys attempt to balance on a wooden plank they had set up as a makeshift seesaw. "Higher, Miss Grant," one of the boys shouted. "I think that is quite high enough, Tommy," she called back, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around everyone in that yard. "I would prefer not to have to explain to your mother how you broke your arm during recess." The children laughed, and so did she, and Robert found himself pulling the wagon to a stop even though he had no reason to do so. He watched as she knelt down to comfort a little girl who had apparently scraped her knee, producing a clean handkerchief from her apron pocket and dabbing at the injury with gentle efficiency. The girl stopped crying almost immediately, distracted by whatever story Miss Grant was telling her, her small face lighting up with wonder. Another child, a boy who could not have been more than 6, wrapped his arms around Miss Grant's waist from behind, nearly knocking her over. She laughed again and turned to ruffle his hair, saying something that made him beam with pride. She had that effect on all of them, Robert noticed. Every child in that yard looked at her with complete adoration, hanging on her every word, seeking her approval, basking in her attention. Robert had never given much thought to children or families or any of that. After their parents died when Robert was 19 and Samuel was 17, the 2 brothers had been sufficient family for each other. There had been no time for courting or thinking about a future that involved a wife and children. And after Samuel died, the idea of building any kind of family seemed not just impossible, but somehow disloyal to the memory of what he had lost. But watching this woman with these children, seeing the natural way she moved among them, the instinctive care and attention she gave to each one, something shifted in Robert's chest. It was not quite pain and not quite hope, but somewhere in between. a recognition of something he had not known he was missing. "You planning to sit there all day blocking traffic, Irving?" Robert jerked his attention away from the schoolyard to find old Henry Morrison standing beside the wagon, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "Just resting the horses," Robert said, which was obviously a lie since they had only traveled 3 miles from the ranch. "Uh-huh," Henry said, following Robert's previous line of sight to the schoolyard. "That is our new schoolteacher, Miss Margaret Grant. Arrived about 3 months ago from somewhere back east, Pennsylvania, I think, or maybe it was Ohio. My memory is not what it used to be." "I was not asking," Robert said. "You were staring, though," Henry pointed out. "Whole town is quite taken with her. She has done wonders with the children. Even got the Morrison boys interested in their letters, and Lord knows their father never managed that. Good for her," Robert said, gathering the reins. "She is unmarried," Henry added helpfully, "in case you were wondering." "I was not. 24 years old. Lives in the room attached to the schoolhouse. Takes her meals at the boarding house most evenings. Attends church every Sunday without fail." Robert gave Henry a long look. "You seem to know quite a lot about her." Henry shrugged. "Small town. Not much else to talk about. Plus, my daughter Emily is one of her students. Comes home every day with stories about how wonderful Miss Grant is. You would think the woman walked on water to hear Emily tell it." Robert glanced back at the schoolyard one more time. Miss Grant was now organizing the children into a line, preparing to lead them back inside. She counted heads, making sure she had everyone, her expression focused and responsible. Then she smiled at something one of the children said, and that brightness returned to her face, transforming it entirely. "The Hendersons are probably wondering where their supplies are," Robert said, clicking his tongue to get the horses moving. He completed his errands with his usual efficiency, loading the wagon with feed, flour, sugar, coffee, and the various other items on the list Mrs. Henderson had given him. He should have headed straight back to the ranch. There was work to be done, fences to mend, cattle to check on. Instead, he found himself driving the wagon past the schoolhouse one more time. The yard was empty now, the children inside receiving their lessons. Through the open window, Robert could hear Miss Grant's voice, though he could not make out the words. She seemed to be reading something, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of a story, occasionally pausing for what he assumed were questions or comments from her students. Robert shook his head at his own foolishness and directed the horses toward the edge of town. Whatever momentary distraction Miss Margaret Grant had provided, it was time to return to reality. He had work to do and no business thinking about blonde schoolteachers with kind smiles and a gift for making children laugh. The problem was that he could not stop thinking about her. Over the next week, as he worked on the ranch, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree, helping to brand new calves, riding out to check on the herd in the far pasture, her image kept appearing in his mind. The way she had knelt beside that crying child. The way the sunlight had caught in those loose strands of her hair, the sound of her laughter. "You are awfully distracted lately," John Henderson observed on Saturday afternoon as they worked together to move a group of cattle to fresh grazing land. John was the oldest son of the family, 32 years old and married with 2 children of his own. He was a good man and a fair boss, treating the ranch hands with respect and working just as hard as anyone else. "Just focused on the work," Robert said. "Uh-huh. Is that why you have been staring at that same cow for the past 5 minutes?" Robert blinked and realized John was right. He had been sitting on his horse, completely still, his attention somewhere other than where it should be. "Sorry," he muttered. "No need to apologize. Just wondered if something was on your mind. You know you can talk to me if you need to. I know the past couple of years have been hard." Robert appreciated the offer, but he did not know what to say. How could he explain that he could not stop thinking about a woman he had seen for all of 10 minutes from across a street? It sounded absurd even in his own head. "I am fine," he said. "Just tired, I suppose." John did not look convinced, but he let it drop, and they finished moving the cattle without further conversation. That Sunday, Robert did something he had not done in 2 years. He went to church. The small church in Lovelock was a simple wooden structure with a white steeple and rough-hewn pews that could seat maybe 70 people if everyone squeezed in tight. Robert had attended regularly before Samuel died, more out of habit and social obligation than any deep faith, but afterward he had found he could not stomach it. All those pitying looks, those whispered condolences, the assumption that prayer and scripture would somehow fill the hole his brother's death had left. But if Miss Grant attended church every Sunday without fail, as Henry Morrison had said, then church was where she would be this Sunday morning. Robert arrived just as the service was beginning, slipping into a pew at the back and drawing more than a few surprised glances from people who had not seen him darken the church door in years. He ignored them, his eyes scanning the congregation until he found her. She sat 3 rows from the front, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap, her attention focused on Reverend Thomas as he began his sermon. She wore a green dress today, simple but well made, and her hair was arranged in the same practical bun. Every few minutes, she would turn slightly to smile at a child sitting near her, or to gently redirect a fidgeting student, and Robert realized that even on Sunday she was still very much a teacher, still caring for her charges. The service seemed to last forever. Robert barely heard a word of the sermon, too focused on watching Margaret, learning the small details of how she moved, how she tilted her head when she was listening intently, how she reached up to tuck back that same stubborn strand of hair that kept escaping her bun. When the service finally ended and people began filing out, Robert hung back, suddenly uncertain of his plan. What was he going to do? Introduce himself? Say what exactly? That he had been watching her with the children and decided she seemed nice. But the choice was taken from him when Reverend Thomas spotted him near the door. "Robert Irving, as I live and breathe," the Reverend said warmly, clasping Robert's hand in both of his. "It is wonderful to see you here, truly wonderful." "Reverend," Robert said, acutely aware that people were now looking at them, including Miss Grant, who had been in conversation with Mrs. Henderson but had turned at the sound of his name. "We have missed you these past 2 years," Reverend Thomas continued. "I know what happened with Samuel was a terrible tragedy, but I am glad to see you returning to the fold." Robert did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded. "Have you met our new school teacher yet?" The Reverend asked, and before Robert could answer, he was gesturing for Miss Grant to join them. "Miss Grant, allow me to introduce Robert Irving. Robert works on the Henderson Ranch. Robert, this is Miss Margaret Grant, who has been teaching our children since January." Margaret extended her hand, and Robert took it carefully, very aware of how small and soft it was compared to his own work-roughened hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Irving," she said. Her eyes were green, he noticed, a light green like new leaves in spring. "Madam," he managed. "The pleasure is mine. I have seen you ride past the schoolhouse a few times," she said, "usually with the Henderson wagon," so she had noticed him. The thought made something warm spread through Robert's chest. "I pick up supplies for the ranch most weeks," he explained. "The Hendersons are a wonderful family," Margaret said. "Their children, Emma and Joseph, are 2 of my best students. Emma especially has a real gift for reading. I can hardly keep her in books." I will let John know you said so. He will be pleased." There was a brief pause, and Robert scrambled for something else to say, something that would keep this conversation going, but Mrs. Henderson appeared at Margaret's elbow. "Miss Grant, you must come to Sunday dinner," she said. "I insist. We are having a roast, and I made far too much food as usual." "That is very kind of you, Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said. "I would be delighted." "Wonderful. Robert, you will join us too, will you not? You have been taking too many meals alone in the bunkhouse. It is settled, then. Both of you will come." Robert wanted to protest that he had not actually been invited, but the look on Mrs. Henderson's face told him that resistance was futile. Besides, the prospect of spending more time in Margaret's company was not exactly a hardship. "Thank you, madam," he said. "I would be honored." The Henderson house was a large, comfortable structure about a half-mile from the main ranch buildings. The Sunday dinner table was crowded with John and his wife Sarah, their 2 children Emma and Joseph, John's parents Mary and Thomas Henderson, John's younger sister Alice, who was visiting from Carson City with her husband and baby, 2 other ranch hands who apparently also could not escape Mary Henderson's hospitality, and now Margaret and Robert. Robert found himself seated across from Margaret, which gave him an excellent view of her, but also made him acutely self-conscious about his table manners. He had not dined in polite company in years, and was suddenly worried about using the wrong fork or reaching for something instead of asking for it to be passed. But Margaret had a way of putting people at ease. She asked thoughtful questions, listened with genuine interest to the answers, and shared stories from the schoolhouse that had everyone laughing. She told them about Tommy Morrison trying to bring his pet frog to class, about little Susan Wheeler, who insisted on wearing her princess costume every single day, about the time the children had decided to put on a surprise play for Margaret and had somehow convinced young Billy Foster to play the part of a tree, which apparently involved standing very still in the corner for 20 minutes. "They are wonderful children," Margaret said, her face glowing with affection. "Challenging sometimes, certainly, but wonderful. Each one of them is so unique, so full of potential. I feel incredibly fortunate to be part of their lives." "We are the fortunate ones," Mary Henderson said. "You have made such a difference in such a short time. Emma has learned more in the past 3 months than in the entire year before you arrived." Emma beamed at the praise, and Margaret reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Emma is a joy to teach," Margaret said, "as is Joseph. You should be very proud of them both." Robert watched this exchange and felt that same shift in his chest he had experienced when he first saw her in the schoolyard. She was not just good with children. She genuinely loved them. It was evident in every word she spoke, every gesture she made. And they loved her in return. After dinner, while the women cleared the table and the children went outside to play, Robert found himself on the porch with John and Thomas Henderson and Alice's husband, a banker named William. "Miss Grant seems to have settled in well," William observed, lighting a pipe. "She is a godsend," Thomas said. "The previous teacher we had was fine, but she never really connected with the children the way Margaret has. The school board was very fortunate to find her." "I heard she came west after her father died," John said. "Left her with no family to speak of, decided she wanted a fresh start somewhere new." Robert felt a pang of sympathy, so she knew something about loss too. "Has anyone in town tried courting her yet?" William asked, and Robert's attention sharpened. "Oh, several have tried," Thomas said with a chuckle. "David Peterson asked permission to call on her within a week of her arrival. She turned him down politely but firmly. Same with Martin Hughes and that young lawyer who set up practice here last fall. What was his name?" "Gerald something," John supplied. "She has made it clear she is focused on her teaching and not interested in courtship at the moment." "Shame," William said. "She seems like excellent wife material. Good with children, smart, pleasant to look at. Some man is going to be very lucky when she changes her mind." Robert said nothing, but the information settled uncomfortably in his mind. She was not interested in courtship. That should discourage him, should make him abandon whatever foolish thoughts he had been entertaining. But somehow it did not. If anything, it made him more intrigued. What would it take for her to change her mind? What kind of man would she even want? He certainly was not that man. He was a ranch hand with a dead brother and a guilty conscience, barely able to make conversation at a dinner table, much less conduct a proper courtship. She deserved someone better, someone whole. The thought should have settled the matter. Instead, it just made the ache in his chest more pronounced. When it came time to return to town, Robert offered to drive Margaret in the wagon, and Mary Henderson endorsed this plan enthusiastically, despite the fact that Margaret had walked to church that morning and presumably could walk back just fine. "It is getting dark," Mary insisted. "And you never know what kind of trouble might be lurking on the roads these days. Robert will see you home safely." Margaret thanked her for the lovely meal and allowed Robert to help her up onto the wagon seat. They rode in silence for the first few minutes, the wheels creaking, the horses' hooves clopping steadily against the packed dirt road. "You have a kind family," Margaret said eventually. "The Hendersons." "They are not my family," Robert clarified. "I just work for them." "Oh, I apologize. I assumed since you were at dinner." "Mrs. Henderson has a habit of collecting strays," Robert said, then immediately regretted the phrasing. "That came out wrong. I meant she is very welcoming, sometimes too welcoming for her own good." Margaret smiled. "I think it is lovely. The way she opens her home and treats everyone like family. The world could use more people like her." "You seem like that kind of person yourself," Robert said. "With the children, I mean. I saw you with them, in the schoolyard last week. You were watching me teach." Robert felt heat rise to his face, grateful for the growing darkness that might hide it. "I was picking up supplies. I just happened to notice." "I see." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you think?" "I thought they were lucky to have you. I thought you were a natural with them." "That is kind of you to say. I love teaching. I always knew I wanted to work with children. Even when I was a child myself, I would line up my dolls and pretend to give them lessons." She laughed softly at the memory. "My father used to say I was born to be a teacher." "He must have been proud of you." "He was." Her voice grew softer. "He died last year. That is why I came west. Everything back in Ohio reminded me of him. I needed a fresh start somewhere he had never been, somewhere without all those memories." "I understand that," Robert said quietly. "Do you?" He hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. In a town like Lovelock, she would hear the story eventually anyway. "My brother was killed 2 years ago, shot through a saloon window right here in town. He was a marshal. I was a deputy. We were supposed to be serving together for years, watching each other's backs. Instead, I stood there and watched him die and could not do anything to stop it." Margaret drew in a sharp breath. "I am so sorry. That must have been devastating." "It was. Still is most days. I quit the marshal service afterward. Could not wear the badge anymore. The Hendersons took me on when I needed work. That was kind of them. They are kind people." They had reached the edge of town now, and the schoolhouse came into view. Robert pulled the wagon to a stop outside, then climbed down and came around to help Margaret descend. She placed her hand in his, and once again he was struck by how delicate it felt. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Irving," she said once her feet were on the ground. "Robert," he said. "You can call me Robert. Then you must call me Margaret." "Margaret." He liked the way her name felt in his mouth. "I enjoyed talking with you tonight, as did I. Perhaps we will see each other again soon." I am in town most weeks for supplies." "Then I shall watch for you," she said, and smiled in a way that made Robert think maybe, just maybe, she was not entirely opposed to his company. He climbed back onto the wagon, tipped his hat to her, and drove away, very aware that she stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse watching him until he turned the corner and disappeared from view. Over the next several weeks, Robert found reasons to come to town more frequently. Suddenly, the ranch needed supplies twice a week instead of once. He volunteered to deliver messages, pick up mail, run errands that any of the other hands could have easily handled. And every time he was in town, he made sure to pass by the schoolhouse. Sometimes he would arrive during recess and would watch from a distance as Margaret supervised the children at play. She had seemingly endless patience for their games and questions, endless energy to keep up with their running and jumping and exploring. She refereed disputes with fairness and compassion, comforted injuries with gentle efficiency, and celebrated small victories with genuine enthusiasm. Other times he would pass when school was in session and would hear her voice through the open windows, teaching arithmetic or grammar or history, somehow making even the dullest subjects sound interesting and important. And sometimes, if he timed it right, he would arrive just as school was letting out and Margaret would see him and wave. And occasionally she would come over to talk for a few minutes, asking how he was, telling him funny stories about her students, making him laugh in a way he had not laughed in years. "You are in town again," John Henderson observed one Thursday afternoon when Robert returned to the ranch with supplies. "That is the third time this week." "Just being efficient," Robert said, unloading sacks of grain from the wagon. "Robert, I am going to say this as your friend and not as your employer. Everyone in town is talking about how you have been courting the schoolteacher." Robert nearly dropped the sack he was holding. "I have not been courting her. I have just been talking to her. That is called courting. I pass by the school. Sometimes we exchange pleasantries. That is not courting." John leaned against the wagon and crossed his arms. "Do you want it to be courting?" That was the question, was it not? Robert set down the grain sack and wiped his brow, buying himself time to think. "I do not know what I want," he said finally. She is remarkable, John. She is kind and smart, and the way she is with those children, it is like nothing I have ever seen. But she already turned down several men who tried to court her. She made it clear she is not interested in that. And even if she were, what do I have to offer her? I am a ranch hand with nothing to my name. She deserves someone better. She deserves someone who cares about her, John said. Someone who sees her for who she is and appreciates her. From where I am standing, that describes you pretty well. And for what it is worth, Sarah says Margaret asks about you. Wants to know if you will be at church on Sunday, whether you will be coming to town this week. She notices you, Robert. Maybe you should stop making excuses and actually ask permission to call on her properly. The idea terrified Robert. What if she said no? What if she confirmed what he already suspected, that he was not good enough for her? But what if she said yes? That possibility, slim as it seemed, was enough to keep him thinking about it for the next 3 days. By Sunday, he had worked himself into such a state of anxiety that he considered skipping church entirely. But that would be cowardly, and whatever else Robert was, he had never been a coward. So he went to church, and he sat in his usual pew in the back, and he watched Margaret in her usual spot near the front. And when the service ended, he made himself walk up to her before he could talk himself out of it. "Margaret," he said, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course," she said, excusing herself from the conversation she had been having with Reverend Thomas. They stepped outside into the bright June sunshine, and Robert realized he had not actually planned what to say. He had been so focused on building up the courage to approach her that he had not thought about the actual words. "I wanted to ask," he began, then stopped. This was harder than facing down angry cattle or breaking wild horses. "I have enjoyed our conversations these past weeks, very much. And I wondered if you might allow me to call on you properly, if you would be open to that." Margaret's expression was difficult to read. She looked surprised, certainly, but whether that was good surprise or bad surprise, Robert could not tell. "You want to court me," she said slowly. "I know you have turned down others," Robert said quickly. "And I understand if you feel the same way about me. I just thought I should ask, so you would know how I feel." "How do you feel?" That was a loaded question. How could he explain the way his heart lifted every time he saw her? The way her laugh had become his favorite sound. The way watching her with those children had awakened something in him he had thought died with Samuel. "I feel like you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met," he said honestly. "I feel like I could watch you laugh with those children for the rest of my life and never get tired of it. I feel like maybe, if you gave me a chance, I could make you happy. Or at least, I would try my hardest to." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Robert braced himself for rejection. "I turned down those other men because they did not really know me," she said finally. "They saw a schoolteacher, an unmarried woman of appropriate age, and decided I would do as well as anyone else. But you—" She paused, looking at him with those remarkable green eyes. "You see me. You notice the work I do with the children. You listen when I talk about them. You remember the small things I mention. That is different." Hope sparked in Robert's chest. "Does that mean—" "It means yes," Margaret said and smiled. "Yes, Robert, you may call on me. I would like that very much." Robert felt like he could float, like the weight he had been carrying for 2 years had suddenly lifted. "Really, really?" She laughed at his expression. "You look shocked." "I am shocked, pleasantly shocked, the best kind of shocked. I do have one condition, though." The weight started to settle back. "What is it?" "You have to tell me about Samuel. Not today necessarily, but eventually. You carry him with you everywhere you go. I can see it in your eyes. And if we are going to do this properly, I need to know all of you, including the parts that hurt." Robert swallowed hard. He had not talked about Samuel, really talked about him, since the funeral. But if that was what it took to have a chance with Margaret, he would do it. "All right," he said. "I can do that. Good." She reached out and touched his hand briefly, just a quick brush of her fingers against his, but it sent electricity through his entire body. "I should go. I promised Mrs. Henderson I would help her with something this afternoon. But perhaps you could come to dinner at the schoolhouse tomorrow evening. I can cook, I promise. It may not be fancy, but it will be edible." "I would love that," Robert said. "Thank you, Margaret, for giving me a chance." "Thank you for asking," she said. "I will see you tomorrow at 7. She walked away, and Robert stood there in the churchyard, grinning like a fool, not caring who saw him. The next evening, Robert showed up at the schoolhouse at precisely 7 o'clock, wearing his cleanest shirt and holding a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from the meadow near the ranch. He had agonized over whether flowers were appropriate for a first dinner, but Sarah Henderson had assured him they were perfect, so he trusted her judgment. Margaret opened the door and smiled when she saw the flowers. "These are beautiful. Come in." The room attached to the schoolhouse that served as Margaret's living quarters was small but tidy, with a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a dresser, and a shelf full of books. She had made it homey with colorful quilts and curtains, a vase of flowers on the windowsill, and children's drawings pinned to the wall. "My students made those for me," she explained when she noticed him looking at the drawings. "They give me a new one almost every day. I cannot bear to throw them away." "That is because you love them," Robert said. "I do," Margaret agreed simply. "They are wonderful children, every single one of them." She had prepared a simple but delicious meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and green beans with apple pie for dessert. They ate at the small table, their knees nearly touching in the cramped space, and talked about everything and nothing. Margaret told him more about her childhood in Ohio, about her mother who had died when Margaret was 12, about her father who had been a doctor and had encouraged her education even though many people thought too much learning was wasted on a girl. Robert told her about growing up in Missouri, about how he and Samuel had come west after their parents died, looking for adventure and opportunity. About how they had both joined the Marshal Service, believing they were doing important work, keeping people safe. "Do you miss it?" Margaret asked. "Being a lawman, sometimes," Robert admitted. "I believed in the work, still do, I suppose, but I cannot separate it from what happened to Samuel. Every time I think about wearing that badge again, I see him falling, hear that gunshot, and I just cannot do it." "That is understandable. Trauma changes us. It has to. If it did not, we would not be human." "You sound like you speak from experience." Margaret nodded. "When my father died, I could not stay in our house. Everything reminded me of him. His chair by the fire where he would read in the evenings. The surgery where he saw patients. The sound of the front door opening and my instinct to call out greeting, only to remember he would never walk through that door again. I had to leave. Had to find somewhere new where the absence of him would not be so constantly present." "Is it easier here?" "In some ways. I still miss him every day. But here, I can think about the good memories without being overwhelmed by the loss. Here, I can build something new, a life that honors what he taught me but is not defined by his absence." She reached across the table and took Robert's hand. "You could do the same, you know. Find a way to honor Samuel without being consumed by how he died." "I do not know how to do that." "Maybe you do not need to know right now. Maybe it is enough to just keep living, keep finding moments of joy, keep letting yourself feel things again." She squeezed his hand. "Keep having dinner with schoolteachers who talk too much." Robert laughed, and it felt good. "You do not talk too much. I like listening to you." They talked long into the evening, until the candles burned low, and Margaret finally admitted she needed to sleep since she had students in the morning. Robert did not want to leave, but he forced himself to stand and thank her for the meal. "This was wonderful," he said. "All of it." "I agree," Margaret said. "We should do it again soon." "How about Friday?" "Friday is perfect." Robert walked back to the ranch under a sky full of stars, feeling lighter than he had in years. This was what hope felt like, what possibility felt like. And it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Over the next 2 months, Robert and Margaret fell into a pattern. He would come to town at least twice a week, sometimes more, and they would spend time together. Sometimes they would take walks around town, Margaret pointing out which children lived in which houses and telling him stories about each family. Sometimes they would sit on the steps of the schoolhouse and talk until the stars came out. Sometimes Margaret would cook dinner, and sometimes they would eat at the boarding house. And slowly, carefully, Robert told her about Samuel. Not all at once, but in pieces. He told her about how Samuel had always been the funnier one, the charming one, the one people naturally gravitated toward. How Robert had always been more serious, more reserved, but Samuel had brought out a lighter side in him. He told her about their adventures as lawmen, about the time they had to chase down a horse thief through 3 counties, about the time Samuel had accidentally arrested the mayor's son for public drunkenness and refused to let him go despite the political pressure. And he told her about the day Samuel died, about the randomness of it, the senselessness. How they had just been standing at a bar, not even on duty, just brothers having a drink together. how the bullet had been meant for someone else entirely, a gambler who had been standing near them and who had ducked at just the right moment. How Samuel had bled out in Robert's arms while people screamed and ran and nobody could do anything to help. Margaret listened to all of it, holding his hand, sometimes crying with him, never trying to tell him it was all right or that he should be over it by now. She just listened and understood, and that was more than Robert had even known he needed. In return, she told him about her father's death. How he had been sick for months, his body slowly failing, and how she had nursed him through it all, watching the man who had been so strong and capable become weak and helpless. How he had made her promise in those final days that she would not spend her life grieving him, that she would go out and live fully, love deeply, find joy wherever she could. "I think he would like you," Margaret said one evening as they sat on the schoolhouse steps watching the sunset. "He always said I should find a good man with a kind heart. Someone who would treat me as an equal and support my work. That is you, Robert." "I hope I can live up to that," Robert said. "You already do." By August, the entire town knew they were courting and the general consensus seemed to be approval. The Hendersons were delighted. The other ranch hands teased Robert mercilessly, but in a good-natured way. The children in Margaret's class had apparently decided Robert was wonderful because Miss Grant liked him, and they greeted him enthusiastically whenever he appeared. It was one of those children who inadvertently pushed things to the next level. Robert had stopped by the school during recess on a Tuesday afternoon, and Margaret had waved him over to where she was supervising the children. Tommy Morrison, the same boy who had wanted her to let him go higher on the seesaw all those months ago, ran up to them. Miss Grant, my ma is having a baby," he announced excitedly. "That is wonderful news, Tommy," Margaret said warmly. "You must be very excited to be a big brother." "I guess so. Ma says babies cry a lot, but she also says they are nice to hold." He looked between Margaret and Robert with the innocent curiosity of a 7-year-old. "Are you two going to get married and have babies?" Margaret turned bright red, and Robert felt his own face heating up. "That is a rather personal question, Tommy," Margaret said gently, "and not really appropriate to ask. But everyone says you are courting, and my pa says courting is what people do before they get married, so I just wondered." "Well, you can tell your pa that these things take time," Margaret said. "Now go play. Recess will be over soon." Tommy ran off, apparently satisfied with this answer, but the question hung in the air between Margaret and Robert. "I apologize for that," Margaret said. "Children have no filter sometimes." "He is not wrong, though," Robert said, "about what courting leads to. At least, that is usually the intention." Margaret looked at him. "Is that your intention with us?" It was a fair question, and Robert realized he needed to answer it honestly. "Yes," he said. "If I am being truthful, yes. I know we have only been courting for 2 months, and maybe it is too soon to say this, but Margaret, I love you. I love everything about you. I love how you are with these children. I love how you listen and understand. I love your strength and your kindness and your laugh. I love the way you made me believe I could feel this way again after I thought I was too broken to feel anything. And if you will have me, I would very much like to marry you someday." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Robert Irving, are you proposing to me in a schoolyard full of children? Not officially, not without a ring and doing it properly, but I am telling you my intentions so you know, so you can decide if that is what you want too." "It is," Margaret said softly. "It absolutely is." "I love you too, Robert. I think I have since that first Sunday dinner at the Hendersons when I watched you struggle to make conversation and be polite and try so hard even though you were clearly terrified. You have the biggest, kindest heart, and yes, I want to marry you. Whenever you are ready to ask properly, my answer will be yes." Robert wanted to kiss her right there, but they were in full view of a dozen children and half the parents in town, so he settled for taking her hand and squeezing it tightly. "Then I better start saving up for a ring," he said. "I do not need anything fancy," Margaret said. "Just you. That is all I have ever needed." The next weeks were some of the happiest of Robert's life. He worked extra hours on the ranch, saving every penny he could toward a ring. John Henderson, upon learning of Robert's intentions, gave him a raise and promised him a piece of land to build a house on if he wanted it. "You have been a good worker and a loyal hand," John said. "If you are going to settle down here, start a family, you will need more than a bunk in the ranch house. There is a nice piece of property about a mile from here, near the creek. Good land for building, good water access. It is yours if you want it." Robert was overwhelmed by the generosity. "I cannot accept that. It is too much." "You can and you will. My father and I have already discussed it. We know good men are hard to find and we want to keep you here. Besides, Sarah is already planning to help Margaret with the house. You might as well give in now and accept it." So Robert accepted, and he spent his evenings sketching out plans for a small house. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms to start, with room to add more later if they needed. A kitchen where Margaret could cook. A living room with a fireplace for cold winter nights. A porch where they could sit and watch the sunset. He showed the plans to Margaret one evening, and she looked at them with tears in her eyes. "It is perfect," she said. "Absolutely perfect. You even put in a room for a study. That is very thoughtful." "I thought you might want space for your books," Robert said. "And maybe someday, when we have children, you can teach them there too. If you want to keep teaching, I mean. I know how important your work is." "I do want to keep teaching," Margaret said, "at least for a while. Though I suppose once we have babies of our own, that might become more complicated." "We will figure it out together," Robert promised. In September, Robert finally had enough saved to buy a ring. It was not the fanciest ring in the jeweler's case in Reno, where he had traveled specifically to shop, but it was pretty, with a small diamond set in a gold band, and the jeweler assured him it was good quality. He brought it back to Lovelock on a Friday afternoon, his heart pounding with anticipation and nerves. He had a whole plan. He would take Margaret on a walk after dinner, lead her down to the creek where they had spent so many evenings talking, and propose there as the sun set. It would be romantic and memorable and perfect, but plans have a way of going awry. Robert arrived at the schoolhouse to find Margaret in tears, surrounded by several worried-looking parents and the town doctor. "What happened?" Robert demanded, immediately fearing the worst. "It is Emma Henderson," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "She fell during recess. From the tree, she hit her head." Robert's stomach dropped. Emma was John's eldest child, bright and cheerful and one of Margaret's favorite students. "Is she all right?" "The doctor is with her now," one of the mothers said, "but she has not woken up yet." Robert found John and Sarah inside the schoolhouse, hovering near the desk where Emma lay unconscious, a nasty bruise forming on her temple. The doctor was examining her carefully. "She is breathing steadily and her pulse is strong," the doctor said. "I believe she has a concussion. We will need to watch her carefully, but children are resilient. I am hopeful she will wake soon." "This is my fault," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I was supervising. I should have stopped her from climbing so high." "This is not your fault," Sarah said firmly, taking Margaret's hands. "Emma knows better than to climb that high. She made a choice. Accidents happen." But Margaret clearly did not believe that. She blamed herself. Robert could see it in every line of her body. Emma woke up an hour later, groggy and in pain but alive and aware. The doctor said she would need to rest for several days and should not return to school for at least a week, but she would be fine. The relief in the room was palpable, but Margaret remained shaken. That night, when Robert finally got her alone, she was still trembling. "I keep thinking about what could have happened," she said. "If she had fallen differently, if she had landed on her neck instead of her side. I could have lost her, Robert. I could have lost one of my children because I was not careful enough." "You are always careful," Robert said, pulling her into his arms. "You watch them like a hawk, but you cannot prevent every accident. You cannot protect them from everything." "I should be able to," Margaret insisted. "That is my job, to keep them safe." "Your job is to teach them," Robert corrected gently, "and to care for them, which you do beautifully. But you are not responsible for every bump and bruise and scraped knee. You are human, Margaret. You cannot be everywhere at once." She cried against his chest, and Robert held her, the ring burning a hole in his pocket, his romantic plans forgotten. This was not the right time. She needed comfort, not a proposal. So he held her and let her cry and walked her home when she was finally calm enough to sleep. And he went back to the ranch and put the ring in his drawer and decided he would wait for a better moment. That moment came 2 weeks later. Emma had recovered fully and was back in school, driving Margaret crazy with her insistence that she was fine and could climb trees again if she wanted to. Margaret had slowly released the guilt she had been carrying, helped by Emma herself, who had visited Margaret to apologize for scaring her and to promise to be more careful in the future. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Robert had suggested they take a walk. They headed down to the creek, the same spot Robert had originally planned to propose. The cottonwood trees were starting to turn gold with the coming autumn, and the water burbled peacefully over the rocks. "I love it here," Margaret said, sitting on a flat rock near the water's edge. "It is so peaceful." "Margaret," Robert said, his heart suddenly racing. "Can I ask you something?" Of course. This was it. The moment he had been planning for weeks. Robert knelt down on one knee in front of her, pulling the ring from his pocket. "Margaret Grant, you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. You made me believe in the future again when I thought I had none. You made me want to be a better man. And I know I am just a ranch hand with more past than prospects, but I love you with everything I am. Will you marry me?" Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." Robert slipped the ring onto her finger, and then she was in his arms, kissing him, laughing and crying at the same time. It was messy and perfect, and everything Robert had hoped for. "I love you," Margaret said between kisses. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Robert said. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." "I could never regret this," Margaret promised. They set the wedding date for late November, after the fall term ended. Margaret wanted to finish out the semester before taking time off for their honeymoon and to settle into married life. The town embraced the news with enthusiasm, with the ladies planning a bridal shower and the men organizing a barn raising to help construct the house Robert had designed. Construction began in October, and it seemed like half the town showed up to help. The Henderson men led the effort, but other ranchers and farmers and townsfolk contributed labor and materials. Even some of Margaret's older students helped, carrying tools and water and feeling very important to be included in such adult work. Robert had never experienced anything like it. In his years as a lawman, he and Samuel had moved from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, never building the kind of community connections that led to this kind of support. But Margaret had built those connections in less than a year, and now they extended to him through her. "This is what community means," John explained as they worked together to frame the walls. "When you are one of us, we take care of you, and you have become one of us, Robert. You and Margaret both." The house came together faster than Robert had thought possible. By mid-November, the structure was complete, and Robert spent his evenings after ranch work finishing the interior, sanding floors, painting walls, building furniture. Margaret helped when she could, hanging curtains she had sewn herself, arranging the kitchen, making the house feel like a home. The wedding was held on a clear Saturday afternoon in late November, in the little church where Robert had first worked up the courage to speak to Margaret. The pews were packed with townsfolk, ranch hands, and nearly every one of Margaret's students, all dressed in their Sunday best. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Sarah Henderson had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of the last wildflowers of the season, their colors bright against the white fabric. She was the most beautiful thing Robert had ever seen. They spoke their vows in front of Reverend Thomas, promising to love and honor each other, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as they both lived. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Robert kissed Margaret to enthusiastic applause from the congregation, and Margaret laughed against his lips, that same bright, joyful laugh that had first captured his attention in the schoolyard. The reception was held at the Henderson Ranch, with tables of food, music from a fiddle player who lived in town, and dancing that went on until well after dark. Robert danced with his wife, marveling at how natural it felt to call her that, and watched as she danced with John Henderson, with Thomas Henderson, with Reverend Thomas, and with several of her older students who were thrilled to dance with their beloved teacher. Late in the evening, as they finally prepared to leave for their new house, Emma Henderson approached them shyly. "Congratulations, Miss Grant," she said. "I mean, Mrs. Irving." "You can still call me Miss Grant at school," Margaret said kindly, "if that is easier. Will you keep teaching?" Emma asked, worry evident in her young face. "Now that you are married." "For now, yes," Margaret assured her. "I am not ready to give up my students yet. You are all too important to me." Emma hugged her tightly, and Robert saw several other children waiting for their turn to say goodbye. Margaret hugged them all, promised she would see them Monday morning, and finally allowed Robert to lead her to the wagon that would take them to their new home. Their first night in the house was everything Robert had imagined and more. Margaret moved through the rooms, touching the furniture Robert had built, admiring the details he had included just for her. The shelf in the study for her growing collection of books. The window seat in the bedroom where she could read in the morning light. The large kitchen table built sturdy enough for a family. "It is perfect," she said for the 10th time. "Robert, it is absolutely perfect." "You are perfect," he countered, pulling her close. They made love for the first time in their new bed, in their new home, as husband and wife, and afterward, they lay tangled together, talking quietly about the future they would build together. "How many children do you want?" Margaret asked, tracing patterns on his chest. "I had not thought much about it before I met you," Robert admitted. "But now, as many as we are blessed with, watching you with your students, I know you will be an incredible mother." "I hope so. I worry sometimes that I will not be enough, that I will make mistakes." "You will make mistakes," Robert said. "We both will, but we will love them fiercely and do our best, and that will have to be enough." Margaret smiled and kissed him softly. "I love you, Robert Irving." "I love you too, Margaret Irving." The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Robert had lived alone or in bunkhouses with other ranch hands for years, and had to relearn how to share space with someone. Margaret had been on her own since leaving Ohio and had to get used to having someone care about her comings and goings, her moods, her needs. But they worked through it together, learning each other's rhythms, finding compromises, building the foundation of their life together. Margaret continued teaching through the winter, and Robert continued working at the Henderson Ranch. now with the added responsibility of managing some of the livestock on the piece of land John had given them. In March, Margaret began feeling ill in the mornings, and after a week of this, she visited the doctor. "I am with child," she told Robert that evening, her face glowing with happiness and nerves. Robert swept her into his arms, joy flooding through him. "Truly, truly. The doctor says the baby should arrive in late September or early October." "We are going to be parents," Robert said, the reality of it hitting him. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Margaret confirmed. "Are you happy?" "I am terrified and thrilled in equal measure," Robert admitted. "But yes, I am happy. So incredibly happy." Margaret taught through the end of the school year in May, though the older children had clearly noticed her changing shape and whispered about it when they thought she could not hear. She had already informed the school board that she would need to take time off when the baby came, and they had reluctantly agreed, though they made her promise to return when she was able. The summer months passed slowly as they prepared for the baby's arrival. Sarah Henderson and the other women in town threw Margaret a party where they showered her with blankets and tiny clothes and advice, some of it helpful and some of it contradictory, and all of it well-meaning. Robert built a cradle, working on it in the evenings, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk, making sure there were no rough edges or splinters that could harm his child. He painted it a soft cream color, and Margaret sewed a tiny mattress and bedding to fit inside. On a warm evening in late September, Margaret's labor began. Sarah Henderson came to help, along with the doctor and several other experienced mothers from town. Robert paced outside, listening to Margaret's cries through the window, feeling helpless and terrified. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Just when Robert thought he could not stand it anymore, he heard a baby's cry, high and loud and indignant. Sarah appeared at the door, smiling broadly. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy, strong boy, and Margaret is well." Tired, but well. Robert rushed inside to find Margaret propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. She looked up at him with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Robert, meet your son," she said softly. Robert approached carefully, afraid he might break something, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had wisps of dark hair and was currently scrunched up and red-faced, clearly unhappy about being expelled from his warm, comfortable home. But he was perfect. Absolutely perfect. "He is beautiful," Robert whispered, touching one tiny fist with a careful finger. The baby's hand opened and closed around Robert's finger, gripping with surprising strength. "He has your nose," Margaret said, "and I think he will have your eyes too. Can I hold him?" "Of course, he is your son." Margaret showed Robert how to support the baby's head, and then the tiny weight was in Robert's arms, warm and solid and real. His son. His child. "Hello there," Robert said softly. "I am your father. And I promise you, I am going to do everything I can to keep you safe and happy and loved." The baby yawned, apparently unimpressed by this speech, and Margaret laughed softly. "What should we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names but had not decided on anything definite, wanting to see the baby first before choosing. "I was thinking," Robert said carefully, "if you would be agreeable to it, we could name him Samuel, after my brother." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I think that is perfect." Samuel Irving, a strong name for a strong boy. Over the next weeks, Robert and Margaret adjusted to life as parents. Samuel was a hungry baby who seemed to wake every 2 hours demanding to be fed. Margaret was exhausted from the constant feedings, and Robert did what he could to help, changing nappies, walking Samuel around the house when he was fussy, taking him for short periods so Margaret could sleep. "I had no idea it would be this hard," Margaret admitted one particularly rough night when Samuel had been crying for an hour straight and nothing they did seemed to help. "You are doing wonderfully," Robert assured her, though he felt just as lost as she did. "I teach children every day, but somehow this is completely different. I feel like I should know what I am doing, but I do not." "No one knows what they are doing at first," Robert said. "We are learning together. And look, he is already calming down." Sure enough, Samuel had stopped crying and was now looking around with those unfocused baby eyes, apparently satisfied now that he had made his displeasure known. By the time Samuel was 2 months old, he had settled into more of a routine, and Margaret had regained some of her energy. She began talking about returning to teaching in the new year, though she was not sure how she would manage it with a baby. "I could bring him with me," she suggested one evening as they sat together by the fire, Samuel sleeping in his cradle nearby. "Set up a little area in the schoolroom where he could sleep. Sarah did that with Joseph when he was a baby." "Would that not be distracting for the students?" Robert asked. "Possibly, but it might also be educational. They could learn about caring for babies, about responsibility. And the older girls especially always want to help with the little ones." "If you think you can manage it, I support you," Robert said. "You are an excellent teacher. Those children need you." "Thank you," Margaret said, leaning against him. "I need them too, I think. As much as I love being home with Samuel, I miss the classroom, miss the students, miss feeling like I am making a difference." "You are making a difference," Robert said. "You are raising our son. That is important work. I know, and I love it, but I can do both. I want to do both." So in January, when the new school term began, Margaret returned to teaching with Samuel in tow. The students were delighted to have a baby in the classroom and took turns helping Margaret care for him, fetching blankets when he fussed, singing to him when he cried, and reporting to Margaret whenever he made the slightest sound. It was unconventional, certainly, but it worked. Margaret was happy. The children learned their lessons and gained practical experience in childcare, and Samuel seemed content to sleep or gurgle quietly through most of the school day. Robert would stop by during recess sometimes, and he would find Margaret surrounded by children as always, but now with Samuel on her hip or sleeping in a basket nearby. She looked radiant, completely in her element, managing the chaos with practiced ease. "She is remarkable," John Henderson said one day when he and Robert were working together, and Robert had mentioned Margaret's ability to juggle teaching and motherhood. "I do not know how she does it." "Neither do I," Robert admitted, "but I am grateful for her every day." The years passed quickly. Samuel grew from a baby into a toddler, then a young boy. When he was 2, Margaret became pregnant again, and this time they welcomed a daughter they named Rose. When Rose was 18 months old, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas after Robert's father. Their house, which had seemed so spacious when they first built it, became comfortably cramped with 3 young children running through it. Robert added on 2 more bedrooms, enlarging the house to accommodate their growing family. Margaret continued teaching for several more years, bringing the younger children with her when necessary, until Thomas started school himself, and she decided to focus on being home. By then, she had trained a young woman from town to take over the school, a former student of Margaret's who had been inspired by her example to become a teacher herself. Robert had been promoted to ranch foreman, managing the Henderson operations and their own small herd of cattle that had grown over the years. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, with enough to provide for their children and occasionally help neighbors who fell on hard times. Samuel, who was now 8 years old, showed signs of inheriting his father's skill with horses. He could calm a skittish mare with a few soft words and had no fear of even the largest animals. Rose, at 6, was her mother's daughter, already collecting stray kittens and wounded birds and nursing them back to health with fierce determination. Thomas, at 4, was still finding his way but showed signs of being the family comedian, always making everyone laugh with his observations and antics. One evening in the spring of 1889, as Robert and Margaret sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Margaret leaned against Robert's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever think about that day I first saw you?" she asked. "When you were picking up supplies and stopped to watch me with the students all the time," Robert admitted. "I remember thinking you were a natural with children, that you would make a perfect mother." "You were right," Margaret said, "though I did not know it then. I was so focused on teaching other people's children, I had not really thought about having my own. And now I cannot imagine my life any other way. These 3 wild creatures running around our yard, making noise and mess and filling every moment with chaos and joy. You. This home we have built together, it is everything I never knew I wanted." Robert kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Irving, more now than the day I married you, which I would not have thought possible. I love you too. Thank you for seeing me that day. For taking a chance on a schoolteacher who had sworn off courting. Thank you for saying yes when I asked, for building this life with me, for giving me Samuel and Rose and Thomas, for making me believe in family again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Samuel helped Rose climb a tree while Thomas ran circles around them both, their laughter carrying on the evening air. The sun was setting over the Nevada hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. A horse whinnied in response. The cottonwoods along the creek rustled in the breeze. This was home. This was family. This was everything Robert had thought he lost when Samuel died. Everything he had believed he could never have. Given back to him in abundance through the love of an extraordinary woman who had been willing to take a chance on a broken-hearted cowboy. Another year passed, and Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous ones, and the doctor warned her to rest more, to take things easy. But with 3 energetic children and a household to run, rest was not always easy to come by. Robert hired a woman from town to help with the housework and the children, giving Margaret time to put her feet up and preserve her strength. Sarah Henderson visited often, bringing food and keeping Margaret company, sharing stories about her own pregnancies and assuring Margaret that every pregnancy was different. In late January of 1890, during a particularly harsh winter storm, Margaret went into labor. The snow was falling so heavily that they could barely see the ranch from the house, and there was no way to get the doctor through the drifts. Sarah Henderson came, battling through the storm on horseback, and delivered Margaret's 4th child with only Robert there to help. It was a girl, smaller than the others had been, but with a lusty cry that reassured them she was strong. They named her Hope, because her arrival during the storm felt like a promise that better days were always ahead, no matter how dark things seemed. The children adored their baby sister. Samuel, now 9, was protective and careful, holding her with serious concentration. Rose, 7, wanted to help with everything, fetching diapers and blankets and singing the songs Margaret had sung to her when she was little. Thomas, 5, was fascinated by Hope's tiny fingers and toes, constantly wanting to touch them and marvel at how small they were. "Our family is complete," Margaret said one evening as she nursed Hope while the older children played a game on the floor nearby. 4 children. A good, even number. "Are you sure?" Robert asked, sitting beside her. "We could have a whole schoolhouse worth at this rate," Margaret laughed. "I think 4 is plenty. I am 34 years old, Robert, and as much as I love our children, I think my body has earned a rest." That is fair, Robert agreed. 4 is a good number, perfect even. Besides, Margaret added, I have been thinking about returning to teaching, not full-time but maybe taking on students who need extra help, a few hours a week. The woman who replaced me at the school does a good job, but there are always children who need more individual attention. You can never really stop being a teacher, can you? Robert said fondly. No, I suppose not. It is who I am. Just as being a rancher is who you are. We can be those things and be parents too. We can, Robert agreed. We do. By the time Hope was walking, the older children were becoming more independent. Samuel was helping Robert with ranch work, learning to rope and ride and handle cattle. Rose had started working with the animals too, showing a particular gift for training horses. Thomas was in school now, charming his teacher the way he charmed everyone with his quick wit and infectious enthusiasm. Margaret did return to tutoring, taking on a few students who struggled with reading or arithmetic, working with them in the afternoons while Hope played nearby. She loved the work, loved seeing the moment when a concept finally clicked for a child, when their face lit up with understanding. Robert watched her with those students and saw the same passion and dedication she had shown all those years ago in the schoolyard. She was born to teach, born to nurture and encourage and bring out the best in young people. Motherhood had not diminished that gift. If anything, it had enhanced it, giving her even more patience and understanding. The years continued to pass in a pleasant rhythm of work and family, challenges and joys, ordinary days that somehow added up to an extraordinary life. There were hard times too, of course. A drought one summer that nearly wiped out their cattle. A winter so harsh they lost several animals to the cold. An illness that swept through town and left Hope feverish for days while Margaret and Robert took turns sitting up with her. But they weathered it all together, leaning on each other, on their community, on the strength they had built over years of partnership. Samuel grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's kind heart. At 18, he announced his intention to ask for the hand of Emily Morrison, the daughter of that same Henry Morrison who had told Robert about Margaret all those years ago. Robert and Margaret gave their blessing, and the wedding was held the following spring. Rose, at 16, was still more interested in horses than boys, though Robert suspected that would change eventually. She had her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength, and Robert had no doubt she would do whatever she set her mind to. Thomas, at 14, was talking about becoming a lawyer, fascinated by ideas of justice and fairness. He had his grandfather Samuel's charisma and his grandmother's quick mind, a formidable combination. Hope, at 8, was still finding her way, but she showed signs of inheriting her mother's gift with children, always organizing elaborate games with the younger children in town and making sure everyone was included. One evening in the summer of 1898, Robert and Margaret took a rare moment alone, riding out to the creek where Robert had proposed all those years ago. They had been married 18 years now, and Robert was 46 years old, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined by years of sun and hard work. Margaret was 42, a few silver threads appearing in her blonde hair, laugh lines at the corners of her eyes. But when Robert looked at her, he still saw the woman who had been laughing with her students in a schoolyard, her face glowing with joy and purpose. She was even more beautiful to him now than she had been then, every line on her face a map of their shared life, every gray hair a testament to the years they had spent building something meaningful together. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, noticing his gaze. "Just how lucky I am," Robert said. How one moment of stopping to watch you with those children changed my entire life. Changed both our lives, Margaret corrected. I never expected to fall in love when I came to Nevada. I was running from grief, looking for a fresh start. And instead I found you, found home. Do you ever regret it? Leaving Ohio, coming west, settling in a small town? Never, Margaret said firmly. This is exactly where I was meant to be. With you, with our children, with this community, I would not change a single thing. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creek burble over the rocks, watching the cottonwoods sway in the evening breeze. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the same way it had on countless evenings before. "We have built a good life," Robert said finally. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "We have," Margaret agreed. "And we are not done yet. We still have hope to raise, grandchildren to meet, years ahead of us." "Years ahead of us," Robert repeated, liking the sound of that. "Together." "Always together," Margaret promised. They rode back to the house as the stars began to appear and found their children waiting for them. Samuel and Emily had come for dinner, along with Thomas's new friend from school and Rose's favorite horse trainer, who had stopped by to discuss a new colt. The house was full of noise and laughter and life, exactly the way Margaret had always made it. Robert looked around the table that night at his family, at the children he and Margaret had raised, and the people those children were becoming, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was what Samuel would have wanted for him. Not to spend his life mourning, but to live fully, to love deeply, to build something lasting. And he had done that. With Margaret by his side, he had built a family, a home, a legacy of love that would continue long after he was gone. After dinner, when the guests had left and the children had gone to bed, Robert and Margaret stood on their porch, looking out at the land they had made their own. "I love you," Robert said, pulling Margaret close. "Thank you for this life we have built." "I love you too," Margaret said, resting her head against his chest. "And thank you for seeing me, for seeing who I really was and loving all of it." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for the twists of fate that had brought a broken-hearted cowboy and a grieving schoolteacher together in a small Nevada town, and for the love that had grown between them, strong and true and lasting. The moon rose over the hills, casting silver light across the valley. Somewhere in the house, a child stirred and settled back into sleep. In the barn, horses shifted in their stalls. The world was at peace. And Robert Irving, holding his wife under the Nevada stars, knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly who he was meant to be with, living exactly the life he was meant to live. It was more than he deserved, and everything he had ever wanted, and he would spend the rest of his days making sure Margaret and their children knew how precious they were to him, how they had saved him when he thought he was beyond saving, how they had given him a reason to believe in tomorrow when yesterday had broken his heart. This was home, this was family, this was love, and it was enough. More than enough, it was everything,